Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So, this is part two of the overview. If you haven't seen part one yet, please go and do that now before you carry on. But I will briefly go through it right now. So, this is about the power and conflict cluster. And I went through the introduction. I went through types of power and conflict. I talked about possible pairings and groupings. We talked about form, which means what? Means type of poem. And we talked about techniques and terminology up to grade 4 and 5. Then we mentioned that word classes are also techniques, okay? So don't panic if you can't find similes and metaphors, because word classes are also techniques. And then I went through the structure of the lessons for the individual poems so that I don't have to repeat myself in every video. We talked about the context as well. So AO1, AO2, and AO3. We talked about comparing. So the individual lessons don't go through comparing. There are separate lessons. But remember, you must compare to get even a passing grade. And then I showed you how the videos kind of go through the poems 2 or 3 times at varying levels, starting with grade 4, 5. And that's where we stopped. So we're now going to carry on to the higher grades. So in the videos, the next slide you will see is something like this. It will say to progress to grade 6 and 7 and above, continue on. And the first thing you need to do to get the higher grades is to talk about tone and mood. And there's a diagram in the next slide, but let's go through this slide first. So poetry is about feelings. So when writing about it, you must mention feelings. To a large extent, you'll do this automatically when analyzing your quotes and references. However, if you can make this more explicit, you will get more marks. So tone and mood are to do with feelings, and they are related. Tone refers to the writer's attitude, whilst mood is the atmosphere created in the reader's mind. Quite often, these will be the same, but they can also be different. For example, they are the same in London poem. So sad, angry tone from the writer, the poet, creates a sad and angry mood in the reader, but different in remains. So from the poet, the tone is quite casual and informal, but it creates a serious mood in the reader. Now, this doesn't mean that the poet's actual attitude is casual. It's just a device. It's just just a literary technique or style used to create a certain effect. Okay. And by simply using the terms tone and mood, you will increase your marks, partly because you are also using subject terminology, but also you are showing a deeper understanding of the writer's methods. So here's a diagram. So this is not my diagram. I found it on the internet and it kind of matches what I'm trying to say. So notice, so tone is the apparent attitude of the author. So that's what I was just mentioning. Created by word choice, dialogue, and description, a natural byproduct of the author's style and point of view. Actually, I wouldn't say natural. It's a created mood. It's a deliberate choice by the writer. And then the mood, the emotions evoked by the author, so created in the reader. Created by word choice, subject matter, literary devices, and setting. Well, that's also true here. An intentional component of the author's work. Well, it's also intentional here as well. And then in terms of commonality, as I mentioned, they are kind of similar and related. Tone and mood often influence each other, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Both rely on word choice and detail. tone, and mood are both described using adjectives. Well, yes, that's plus all the other techniques as well. The next thing you need to talk about to get the higher grades are rhyme and rhythm. And these are things that are specific to poetry, unlike novels or plays. However, Shakespeare is an exception because his plays contain a lot of poetry type writing. So this goes back to what I said earlier, that if you master poetry, you are really kind of mastering all the skills you need for all the other topics as well. Rhyme is when the ends of lines sound the same. There's also something called internal rhyming, where words within a line rhyme. In the anthology, there isn't much of that, but it's just worth knowing. You might get it in unseen poetry. Rhythm is like a beat in music. In simple terms, it's simply the number of syllables per line. And one of the most important rhythm schemes is iambic pentameter, which essentially means 10 syllables per line. Okay? So pent from maths you should know means 5. Meter is not a physical meter, it's a poetic meter, which means 2 syllables. So 5 times 2, that's where the 10 comes from. Okay, and this thing I will explain later on. And here's a little diagram, kind of repeating some of what I've just said. Okay, now to get grade 8, 9, it's not quite as simple as going up to grade 7, where it's kind of quite specific. Okay, to get the highest grades, it's not just about your individual points, okay? It's about making sure that your whole essay is almost perfect. Whereas to get a grade 7, only most of it has to be very good, okay? Even if your 2 or 3 of your paragraphs are kind of grade 7 level, you'll mostly get a grade 7. But to get to grade 8, 9, all your paragraphs, your introduction, your conclusion, all have to be almost perfect. Not 100% perfect, but almost perfect. The other way to get these grades is to have original thoughts and ideas that by definition cannot be taught, because obviously if the teacher teaches you, if I teach you, then it's not original. But you don't need huge originality, just tiny bits here and there, tiny thoughts that make the examiner happy and excited, okay? That they're reading something a bit different. And also your grammar and structure must be perfect, even though technically there are not many marks for grammar in the literature exams, only 5%. However, the thing is, you see, grammar does affect the flow, cohesion, and coherence of your essays, hence why it has to be almost perfect. And for grade 8, 9, I will go through these words here. So coherence means the overall meaning of a text, right? And it's related to cohesion because cohesion is one of the tools you use to create the coherence. So cohesion is to do with how your words, phrases, sentences link together, how your paragraphs end, and then the next paragraph begins. I mean, in simple terms, it might be using the correct connectives, for example, but that's just one simple example. Right? So these two things are related. And just going back to what it says here, that your whole essay has to be almost perfect from beginning to end. And then I will give you suggestions for grade 8, 9. So advanced techniques, going deeper into language form and structure, going deeper into context. So some of this we're going to cover in the next few slides. Okay, so we talked about techniques and terminology to grade 4 and 5. Now let's have a look at grade 6 and 7. So we mentioned earlier that a metaphor is a direct comparison. It's a very simple way of saying it. A metaphor is actually any kind of language that is used in a non-literal way. And also many other techniques are also types of metaphor. For example, personification. Okay. Enjambment means going from one line to the next without punctuation. But be careful here. And what I mean by that is that to a certain extent, enjambment is what defines poetry. And we're going to actually look at that later on, that what is a poem. So what I would suggest to you is that you should only talk about enjambment if it's what I call strong enjambment. I mean, that's not an official phrase. I'm just using it in the sense that, for example, if it goes from if the break goes from one stanza to the next, or if it's from one line to the next but really obvious, then you should talk about enjambment. Otherwise, really, it's kind of like the definition of poetry, really. And remains and poppies are two good examples of strong enjambment. Juxtaposition means two contrasting ideas or images. For example, spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. So this is from War Photographer. So here you can see the suffering, and then on the other hand, you've got the ordered rows. Okay, so these two contrasting ideas or emotions. And this is also from War Photographer. So here it's a bit more subtle, but red, the color red usually denotes or connotes danger, death, right? It can also connote romance, but in a different situation. Here we're talking about death and danger, contrasting with the softly. Okay, so a bit more subtle here, but that's another example. An oxymoron is a self-contradictory phrase. For example, marriage hearse in London, in the poem London. So obviously marriage has happy connotations, and normally you'd be traveling in a car with flowers and everything decked out in flowers, whereas a hearse is something that carries a dead body. I mean, actually, a hearse also can have flowers. It does have flowers normally, but you can see that these are contradictory. Okay. Now, sibilance is a type of alliteration. So, alliteration we covered in the previous, in part one. It's a kind of like a grade 4-5 technique. But sibilance is a type of alliteration where the s sound is repeated. For example, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So, notice the repetition there of s. Now, since we are talking about grade 6 or 7, but the next thing I'm going to say is maybe bounding with bordering with grade 8-9 is that actually sibilance is not just the s sound, it's any kind of a hissing sound, any kind of what we call a fricative sound, so any kind of a sound. So even the f here, even though it's not s, is part of the sibilance here. Okay, so that's more like grade 8-9. And then symbolism, using a physical object to represent an abstract idea or emotion. For example, released a songbird from its cage, and later a single dove flew from the pear tree. So this is from poppies. All right. So here, this is symbolizing freedom. Here, symbolizing peace. Okay. Right. Let's move on to grade 8-9 techniques and terminology. I mean, to be honest, there is kind of an overlap here, and the groupings into 7 and 8, sorry, 6 and 7 on the one hand, and 8 and 9 on the other hand, a little bit arbitrary, but I've tried my best here to see if I can divide it up into these grades. And also, it just makes it easier to kind of break up and to talk about. So, caesura, that's how you pronounce this word, is a pause usually created by some kind of a punctuation mark. For example, we are prepared, colon. So that colon makes you stop and pause. So this is from Storm on the Island. And remember, when you identify techniques and so on and use terminology, you can't just mention it. You won't get many marks for that. You need to talk about the effect, okay? So here, and no, you need to tie it with the content. So here, how would you tie it to the content? Well, think about a pause. When we want to do something, when we want to get ready for something, we pause, don't we? We take a breath, right? That's what we're doing here. We're preparing so that the pause is linking to this idea of preparing. We've talked about metaphors. Now, there's third level here, extended metaphor, where metaphor is sustained to a certain extent. So, sustained means continued for some time. Now, some poems, the whole poem is an extended metaphor. In the anthology, we don't really have that. But Storm on the Island, the last part of it, the last few lines, there is an example of a short extended metaphor there. Onomatopoeia. Now, we mentioned this in actual grade 4-5, really, but you can see how these techniques can be discussed at any level almost. So for high levels, onomatopoeia normally we define it in primary school as words like bang, crash, and so on, and that's correct, or yelled, as in the last example we had. But there is a second, deeper meaning to onomatopoeia, which you don't come across very often, and so it's like a second, deeper meaning, which is that words that are suggestive of their meaning are also onomatopoeia. Sometimes they're referred to as visual onomatopoeia. So, for example, dazzled in bayonet charge and flashing in kamikaze, can you see that they sort of sound like their meaning and it's related to sight rather than sound, which is why they're visual onomatopoeia. Okay. Now, this next bit, I put it into grade 8, 9, but perhaps even for grade 8, 6, 7 students, you should be able to understand this really, which is that if the repetition is close together, then it is part of language. If the repetition is spaced apart, then it is part of structure. Okay. So, for example, Dem tell me in checking out my history, the first two lines are this. So that's a language feature. They are repeated together. But this phrase is then also used right at the end. So that's what we call structural repetition. Okay. Because it's not close together, it's spaced apart. And in fact, that then becomes a certain type of structure, doesn't it? Do you remember? Cyclical structure. So that's why you can see how this is structural as well. Okay, so semantic field. Now, the word semantics means to do with meaning. Okay, so and field in this case is not a football field; it's like an area, a topic. Okay, so words from a given topic or subject. For example, spasms, blockade, reinforcements. I haven't put these in quotes, but these are direct words from the poem Poppies, and also tucks, darts, and please. So spasms of pain, blockade, reinforcements, these are words to do with war. Okay, so these three words are from the semantic field of war, because it's a war poem. Tucks, darts, and pleats are words from textile design, because strangely enough, the poet, the writer of Poppies, is a textile designer. Okay, so and you can see therefore why she would use these words. But anyway, these are called semantic fields, words from a given topic. And then synesthesia, mixing the senses. For example, it tastes of sunlight. So this is from the emigre. So notice sunlight is obviously more to do with sight. Obviously, you can feel it as well. So in that sense, it's not maybe totally mixing the senses, but obviously you can't actually taste sunlight. Okay, so this is an example of synesthesia. There are examples in other poems in the other anthology where this synesthesia is even more kind of stark. Okay, but anyway, that's an example of synesthesia. Okay, now let's talk about poetry eras or time periods. So this is part of context, how you can improve your marks on context to get to those higher grades. So romantic doesn't mean to do with it's not doesn't mean love, although it can include love. That's from 1798 to 1837, and then sometimes that's extended to 1840, but I've kept it to 1837 to link nicely to the Victorian age, which is from there to 1901. And then these, after that, you can't just refer to the poems as modern. I've just broken it up a little bit, and these are just arbitrary. Okay, this is just my division. It's not like an official thing. So you might talk about early modern, late modern, or contemporary means now. Right? So simply mentioning the time period will get you some marks for context, but obviously going a bit deeper will get you more marks. And here are some examples. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because Romantic era, Victorian era, these are whole topics in their own right, and they are covered in different videos. But for poetry, you don't need to know too much, okay? So romantic means to do with valuing emotion over reason, nature over industry, and that links to the next bit, which is that it was partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and also a rebellion against traditional forms of poetry. So some of these points here will get you to grade 6 or 7, but some of them will actually get you to grade 8, 9, especially if you maybe do your own bit of research as well. The Victorian era was very repressed, respectful towards authority, and had very defined gender roles. So this links to some of the poems, for example, Charge of the Light Brigade and My Last Duchess. And then modern poetry often does not have rhyme or rhythm. It may use slang and may be from other cultures. So, for example, checking out my history, tissue. Okay. Okay. And then finally, just finishing off on this last slide here. I mean, some of this you don't really need to know, even for grade 8, 9. But when I'm talking to advanced students, it's nice to just be able to talk about these things just for the fun of it. And hopefully, if you are aiming for 8, 9, then you are the sort of student who actually enjoys English for its own sake rather than just passing an exam. So, with form and structure, quite often these are combined. And the reason why they're combined is that you can't really separate them. For example, rhyme and rhythm. So, if you think about a sonnet, right? A sonnet is a 14-line poem with a regular rhyme and rhythm scheme, right? So therefore, straight away you can see that rhyme and rhythm is to do with form, right? Or at least the rhyme and rhythm was to do with form. But then we mentioned 14 lines. That's obviously structure, right? Structure is to do with beginning, middle, and end. It's to do with how many lines there are, how many verses there are, and so on. So you can see there that actually form and structure can't really be separated. In fact, even language comes into it because rhyme, you can't have rhyme without words, right? So you can see that actually even language cannot be separated from form and structure. Okay, so I won't go too much more into that. I hope you found that interesting. So I mentioned that when you ask students what structure means, they normally say, oh, it's the layout. And what they really mean by that is the physical structure. Okay, but remember what I said earlier, that is just a very small part of structure. When we use the word structure by itself, actually we're talking about abstract structure. Okay, so abstract means non-physical. So it's to do with the content, how it's organized, beginning, middle, and end. So if you want, as an advanced student, you can use, instead of just saying structure, you can talk about the individual bits of it, physical structure and abstract structure. Iambic pentameter, so we know that this is, in simple terms, 10 syllables per line. But if you want to know what the iambic means, it means to do with the syllables, unstressed and stressed. So in those 10 syllables, you would have unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. To be honest, even at grade 8, 9, I don't think this is the most useful or interesting thing to talk about, okay? But in case you've ever wondered what it means, that's what it means. And to just end up with, what is a poem? Well, the dictionary definition is a literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Well, that's not very helpful, is it? It's not very clear, but that's what it says. William Wordsworth, one of the great English poets and the poet of The Prelude, calls it a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So the point about this is that actually poetry is very hard to define, but it's very easy to see or hear. We know it when we see it, or we know it when we hear it. So maybe the best definition of poetry is that it sounds and looks like a poem. So in terms of sound, remember poems are meant to be read out loud. Okay. So, and when we read a poem, we kind of, it's not just the sound even, it's our posture, isn't it? We stand up straight and we speak in a certain way, right? Or when we look at a poem, it looks like a poem. The lines are broken, right, into a certain pattern. So this links back to the what I was saying about enchantment. Okay. So again, you don't really need to know this for GCSE. Some of these things on this slide, I'm just talking about for interest. Okay. So there you have it. That's the end of part 2. I hope you found that useful. And if you did, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the first poem in the anthology.